At about 9 p.m., prison authorities inside Altiplano lost visual contact with Mr. Guzman. This is the tunnel that Joaquin Chapo Guzman came out of. We're gonna go down and take a closer look.
For as long as there have been prisons, there have been criminals escaping. From an estimated 10 million prisoners, 600,000 escape each year. Of course, most of them get caught and are given a longer sentence. But when it comes to drug lords and gangsters, well, sometimes they have the upper hand over the police. Today's video will explore some of the craziest gang members' prison breakouts throughout history, from impossible escapes to over-the-top methods. How can the country's public enemy number one have people cheering at the TV when they see his picture and hissing at the detectives? Yep, this is the crazy story of famous robber John Dillinger. John Herbert Dillinger was born on June 22, 1903 in Indianapolis. His father, John Wilson Dillinger, owned a small grocery store and 4 houses. His mother, born Molly Lancaster, died when little Johnny was 3.
Johnny got into a series of scrapes. He and his gang broke into factories, he dropped out of school, worked at a series of jobs in machine shops, and hung around the pool halls.
John's father was not exactly a parenting expert. He would beat his son with a barrel stave, lock him in the house all day, and leave him roaming the streets at night, showing no care about his safety. Before long, John was the leader of a neighborhood gang called the Dirty Dozen, stealing coal from railroad freight cars. When he robbed a grocery with his friend, John was arrested and sent to prison for 9 long years. After he was paroled, he was intent on staying out of prison, but his criminal career was just beginning. In 1933 and 1934, John and his gang robbed 24 banks and 4 police stations. 4 months after he was released from prison, John orchestrated a gang prison escape for all his imprisoned gang buddies. He smuggled guns into the Indiana State Prison and helped 10 men escape by threatening the prison guards. This would come in handy as he would need them to break him free in a couple of days. When John was arrested a second time, he was sent to the Alley County Jail in Lima, Ohio. His men, many of which had just broken out of a different prison, came to the jail impersonating Indiana State Prison officers. Fooling the guards, they casually escorted John Dillinger out as if transferring him to prison. Impersonating officers would also be how Dillinger and his crew would rob banks and police stations most of the time. According to one of his men's girlfriends, Pat Sherrington, this is what John and his gang did once.
They identified themselves as being officials of the NRA in Washington. They advised the bank president they were calling on all banks throughout the state in a survey, and they were very much interested in how the various codes were operating.
Intimidated by so-called higher authority, the bank officials would reveal precious information and put themselves in a vulnerable position. Then, John and his gang would open fire on them. However, the crew would try their best not to kill people during the robberies. After John killed a police officer in January 1934, he said,
"I've always felt bad about O'Malley getting killed, but only because of his wife and kids. He stood right in the way and kept throwing slugs at me. What else could I do?"
Indeed, John Dillinger couldn't see any other option for his life except a career criminal, even after 2 stints in prison, and the third one would bring an even crazier escape. On January 25, 1934, John Dillinger was arrested for a third and final time in Tucson. He was extradited to Indiana for the murder of Officer O'Malley and transported by airplane. This was a very extravagant means of transportation at the time, so it made headlines throughout the country. John put up a fight, so the police shackled him and dragged him into the plane. When they chained him to a post inside, he said,
"Hell, I don't jump out of these things."
John was sentenced to Crown Point Jail in Indiana, a prison that the police boasted was very high security. But on March 3rd, John managed to escape it by using a fake pistol carved out of shelving wood with a razor. John tricked a guard with a fake pistol to open his cell. Then, he took 17 men hostage and lured the guards back to the cell block. John locked all guards into his own cell before leaving out the front door. By now, John Dillinger was famous. All of this was happening during the Great Depression, and the poor American people, disillusioned with the failing banks, saw John as some sort of Robin Hood figure, applauding him for his outlaw nature. On the other hand, they saw the police as John's enemies, and many people cursed and hissed at the pictures of DOI agents proudly announcing the pursuit of Dillinger. Out on the streets, Dillinger was now declared public enemy number 1. In May 1934, John had plastic surgery in an attempt to evade justice and his increasing number of fans, but it was one of his closest friends, Anna Sage, that would prove to be his worst enemy. Anna was facing deportation charges for operating illegal brothels, and by turning John in to the police, she thought her charges would be dropped. On July 22, 1934, Anna, John, and his girlfriend went to see a movie. When it was over, the police ambushed the cinema and shot 31-year-old John fatally. John Dillinger was an outlaw from his very first years of childhood abuse to his ultimate death, and prison never helped rehabilitate him. In his memoirs, government agent Melvin Purvis wrote,
There is probably no one whose career so graphically illustrates the inadequacies of our system as does that of John Dillinger.
If John Dillinger's story sounded crazy, wait till you hear about El Chapo's 2 prison escapes. Even 7 years after his third and final arrest, El Chapo and his notorious Sinaloa cartel are still the talk of the internet. Joaquin Archivado Guzman Lorera was born on April 4, 1957 in a very tiny place called La Tuna in Sinaloa, Mexico. In 1989, he and his cartel buddy El Mayo were working for the giant Guadalajara cartel, led by El Padrino. But as soon as El Padrino was arrested, the whole cartel crumbled and split into tinier factions. And so El Chapo and El Mayo founded their own branch, the Sinaloa cartel, and raised it to be Mexico's most powerful cartel. This title still stands today with El Chapo in prison. El Chapo was in prison twice before being sent to the ADX Florence in 2017. But as far as he was concerned, no prison cell in Mexico could hold him. In 1993, El Chapo was arrested in Guatemala for murdering and drug trafficking. That's right, El Chapo was killing police officers, government officials, and civilians from the very beginning of his nasty cartel. He was extradited to Mexico and sentenced to 20 years in prison. Mexico's government actually thought this might be the end of the Sinaloa cartel, just like in the case of the Guadalajara. But they were very wrong. El Chapo was perfectly capable of conducting his business from prison via phone and visitors. And 8 years into his sentence, El Chapo decided he had had enough. While still in prison, El Chapo was indicted in San Diego on U.S. charges of money laundering and importing tons of white powder into California, along with his Sinaloa attorney, Humberto Loyo Castro, or Lawyer Perez, who was charged with bribing Mexican officials so that any cartel members arrested were released from custody. After a ruling by the Supreme Court of Mexico made extradition between Mexico and the United States easier, El Chapo knew he had to escape. So in classic Sinaloa fashion, he bribed prison guards to ensure his escape. On January 19, 2001, Francisco El Chito Camberos Rivera, a prison guard, opened Guzman's electronically operated cell door, and Guzman got into a laundry cart that maintenance worker Javier Camberos rolled through several doors and eventually out the front door. Once outside, he was transported into the trunk of a car driven by Camberos out of town. At a gas station, Camberos went inside, but when he came back, El Chapo was gone on foot into the night. According to officials, 78 people had been implicated in his escape plan, and El Chapo spent a staggering $2.5 million split between these people. The police in Jalisco were also paid off to ensure El Chapo had at least 24 hours to get out of the state and stay ahead of the military manhunt. El Chito is currently in prison for his assistance in the escape, and so is the faculty's director. It turns out El Chapo owned all prison officials around him by 2001, and the one prison guard who was on the side of justice and reported the situation was disappeared 7 years later. Indeed, El Chapo employs Pablo Escobar's famous saying, plata o plomo. Either be corrupt and accept my bribery, or snitches get stitches. El Chapo had the prison guards on his payroll ever since his arrest in 1993. It was later revealed that he had contraband smuggled into the prison on a regular basis, and he received preferential treatment from the staff. But of course, El Chapo didn't own the whole country, so the manhunt for him continued until he was in prison again. One side of the government was out looking for him, and the other was in his pocket, protecting him and the Sinaloa cartel. In February 2014, El Chapo and El Mayo were tracked down to a family reunion in Sinaloa after El Chapo had been hiding in the Sierra Madre Mountains for years. On February 22nd, the Mexican Navy raided a beach hotel in Mazatlan and arrested El Chapo. He was in a lavish room with his wife Emma Coronel and their twin daughters. El Chapo put up a fight but did not attempt to shoot the officers. He knew it would end badly, especially with his family there.
13 years later, Guzman was caught again at a hotel in Mazatlan, Sinaloa, with the help of U.S. intelligence.
This time, he was transferred to the maximum security prison in Almoloya de Juarez with a Black Hawk helicopter. The American government insisted that El Chapo be extradited to the U.S. so he couldn't bribe his way out of prison again. But the Mexican government felt offended by this proposal, so they said it would take hundreds of years before El Chapo would be extradited, and ensured that Mexico could very well handle him this time. This prison was much tougher than the first one, and El Chapo found he couldn't bribe everyone around him anymore. His cells had no windows, inmates weren't allowed to interact with one another, and they weren't allowed to contact their family members either. El Chapo was allowed to receive visits from members of his family every 9 days with approval from a judge, and was granted by law the right to receive 638 pesos, about $48, every month to buy products for personal hygiene. He was in solitary confinement for 23 hours a day with just 1 hour outdoors. However, even outside, he was not allowed to play sports or talk to other prisoners. It might seem impossible, but El Chapo managed to escape this prison too.
This is the tunnel that Joaquin and Chapo Guzman came out of. We're gonna go down and take a closer look. Let's go check it out, guys. Yeah, this is maybe about 20 feet, 25 feet maybe.
On July 11, 2015, at 8:52 p.m., El Chapo disappeared from the security camera in his cell.
At about 9 p.m., prison authorities inside Altiplano lost visual contact with Mr. Guzman.
How could you disappear inside your own windowless cell? Well, El Chapo had dug a tunnel, starting in his shower and ending on a property miles away.
Joaquin El Chapo Guzman had escaped once more. The following morning, officials had an almost unbelievable account to share with the public.
Imagine having to admit El Chapo escaped prison twice after you promised he wouldn't.
Como se informó la madrugada, el día de ayer, en el Centro Federal de Readaptación Social número 1, Altiplano, se registró la fuga de Joaquín Guzmán Loera, quien estaba ubicado en el área de tratamientos especiales, pasillo número 2, estancia número 20.
El Chapo's second escape generated a nationwide scandal and further soured relationships between Mexico and the U.S.
Las instituciones del Estado mexicano, que en 15 meses lograron la detención de este criminal y de otros muchos más, son las mismas instituciones que están poniendo todo su empeño y capacidades para reprenderlo.
It wasn't just the U.S. that was skeptical of the Mexican government's integrity. According to a former prisoner of Altiplano prison, it was clear El Chapo had preferential treatment this time too.
Lo que me llama la atención es que el reo que dicen que es el Chapo tiene cabello. Todos los días tienes que afeitarte. Te rapan casi cada 20 días, 15 días. Ahí no se discute, ¿eh? Nadie discute nada. Las son órdenes.
Yet somehow, El Chapo managed to keep his hair and dig a mile-long tunnel outside the prison. You might remember that tunnels were El Chapo's specialty ever since his beginnings in the Guadalajara cartel. His tunnels created some of the most profitable drug trafficking routes in Mexico and into the U.S.
Well, we're going to get a first-hand look at the kind of tunnel that the Sinaloa cartel has become famous for constructing in their efforts to traffic drugs across the border. So I think it's safe to assume that this is the sort of tunnels that they use to cross drugs into the United States.
The tunnel was partially reinforced and had wooden planks as the ceiling. A lot of work went into making this tunnel, and clearly, it went on for a long time. El Chapo didn't just plan his escape overnight.
There's a generator here beside me, and the actual tunnel down to the length, the mile-long tunnel is right here. This is the crane that whoever constructed this tunnel used in order to take down and bring up heavy materials such as some of this machinery, and probably, I assume, some of the dirt and rock that was necessary to pull out of here in order to get this tunnel built.
The craziest part? El Chapo even had a makeshift motorcycle fit inside the tunnel, so he wouldn't have to walk the full mile.
Government said this motorcycle contraption-like thing, it's not actually a motorcycle, it's some kind of vehicle that is fitted also with these little carts that was probably used to move the dirt. Well, it's adapted. It doesn't have a front tire. It has a small energy source here. It can move forward and backward. Looks like a very old mining type vehicle.
It's pretty clear some people were bribed here too. It's not like El Chapo did all of this himself. With the security that the prison advertises, he had several people working for him and several prison guards protecting him and keeping his escape project a secret.
Me parece que es una burla a la sociedad el que nos los quieran presentar de esta manera, porque si no le abrieron la puerta, le abrieron un túnel. La principal responsabilidad es de Peña Nieto, de Osorio Chong, del secretario de Seguridad, de la Procuradora, de la Coordinadora General de los CFR.
Needless to say, the U.S. government became stronger in its support of his arrest and extradition. A huge manhunt started for El Chapo. Every border and airport was alerted so that he couldn't leave Mexico, and helicopters searched for him day and night. In 2016, El Chapo and his guard were tracked to a house in Los Mochis. When their house was raided on January 8th, they escaped through, guess what? A mile-long tunnel. Once outside, they stole a car at gunpoint. The federal police located their car dozens of miles south of Los Mochis. When El Chapo was stopped, he attempted to bribe the 4 officers. When they refused, he said,
"You're all going to die."
As the officers contacted the feds, they had already been tipped that 40 sicarios were on their way to free El Chapo. So the police took El Chapo to a motel and called for reinforcements. During the raid, 5 gunmen were killed, 6 others arrested, and 1 Marine was wounded. The Mexican Navy said that they found 2 armored cars, 8 assault rifles, including 2 Beret M82 sniper rifles, 2 M16 rifles with grenade launchers, and a loaded rocket-propelled grenade launcher. This time, Mexico couldn't resist extradition anymore, and you could see the fear on El Chapo's face when he landed in the U.S. He knew that the game was over for his bribery and manipulation. After a 2-year-long trial, he was found guilty of pretty much all charges: murder, money laundering, engaging in continuing criminal enterprise, drug manufacturing, trafficking, using a firearm in the furtherance of drug crimes, and the list goes on. He was sentenced to life imprisonment at the county's highest security federal prison, the ADX Florence in Colorado.
At the administrative maximum U.S. penitentiary, where he will spend his life sentence more than 30 years, according to a United States attorney.
A retired ADX prison guard commented,
For him to escape, he would have to have a warden in his pocket. It's a very controlled environment. No one moves there without permission at all. No 2 inmates move in the facility at the same time.
El Chapo and his fellow inmates, including the Unabomber, spent 23 hours a day inside a soundproof cell. Their only hour of spare time is thoroughly supervised.
All 400 inmates at the ADX spend 23 hours a day in a soundproof cell, and then have 1 heavily supervised 4-hour of rec time.
Not only are prisoners supervised by several guards during rack time, but they're also cuffed and shackled, and their torsos are chained as well. They can't run, jump, or do anything sudden. Of course, phones are also off the table. In fact, the only kind of technology available is a small black and white TV set in their cell, and inmates only receive this TV if they demonstrated good behavior over a long period of time. Here's what the warden said about the prison.
The experience there is like life after death, or should I say, life there is worse than death.
There are several accounts of ADX Florence inmates screaming for hours or hurting themselves, as they simply go mad inside their tiny cells.
Some mutilate their bodies with razors, shards of glass, sharpened chicken bones, writing utensils, and whatever other objects they can obtain.
El Chapo might never leave this horror show, but according to DEA Special Agent Ray Donovan, his punishment makes a lot of sense.
That this is the kind of fate that a man responsible for unspeakable violence and death deserves. Thousands of people died or were ordered killed because of the Sinaloa cartel. So yeah, he doesn't leave his cell. It's boring, it's monotonous, it's a daily routine. It's very sad, but here's the difference. He's alive. And that means he could do plenty of things, unlike many of his victims.
Okay. El Chapo's story was pretty impressive, but it's dialed down by the fact that he used money and influence to have his way. Here's a bunch of guys that had no support, no money, and no outside crew, and yet they escaped the world's most inescapable prison. You probably heard of Alcatraz as one of the toughest prisons in the world. In 1934, it was converted from a military base to a maximum security prison. As you also probably know, Alcatraz is located on a tiny island surrounded by fast-moving, freezing water and located 1.25 miles away from the coast of San Francisco. In other words, it's impossible to escape. Well, almost impossible. In 1962, there were 3 gangsters imprisoned at Alcatraz: Frank Morris and the Englund brothers. Clarence and his slightly older brother John were career bank robbers, much like John Dillinger. John, Clarence, and their third brother Alfred prided themselves on their peaceful tactics. Reportedly, no one was hurt or killed during their robberies, and the only weapon they ever used was a toy gun during a bank heist. But in 1958, the brothers pulled one of their biggest heists at the Columbia Savings Bank in Alabama. The police eventually arrested all 3 brothers and sentenced them to 35 years at the Florida State Prison and Atlanta Penitentiary. However, John and Clarence repeatedly attempted to escape, so the Atlanta authorities had them transferred to Alcatraz. Funny enough, it was Alcatraz that they would manage to escape after meeting Frank Morris. Frank had had a rough start to life. He was abandoned by his parents and moved from one foster home to another. From the age of 13, he spent his life in and out of prison, and as soon as he'd get out, he would go straight back to robbery and drug dealing. However, Frank had an IQ of 133, which put him in the top 2% of the general population. He was smart, savvy, and determined to stay out of prison. When he was around 30, he was arrested for robbery and sentenced to a decade at the Louisiana State Penitentiary, but he soon escaped. In January 1960, a year later, he was arrested and sent to Alcatraz. Again, the authorities thought no one could escape Alcatraz. There was a fourth man, Alan West, who approached Frank about escaping as soon as Frank came to Alcatraz. You see, Alcatraz prison lacked the proper funding for regular maintenance and reparations, and Alan knew of certain cracks in the walls that could come in handy. Alan told Frank that there was a ventilator cover on cell block B that wasn't sealed over with concrete. That year, Alan started working with the prison maintenance crew to note any other weak spots in the building. A year later, the Anglin brothers arrived, and they were soon roped into this plan. By September 1961, all four men had requested to move in cell block B cells, adjacent to one another and positioned right above the ventilator cover. Interestingly, all their requests were approved. Then, the game was on. First, the four men created painted dummy heads from a mix of soap, concrete, and other materials that resembled plaster. Clarence worked as a prison barber, and he collected hair trimmings for all the dummy heads. On the morning of June 12th, guards were wondering why the four men weren't responding to their morning call. They all appeared to be sleeping in their cells, so one guard entered Frank's cell and pushed his head. That's when the dummy head fell on the ground. But by the time the guards realized they escaped, it was too late. For months, the men had been drilling holes around the cover of their cell ventilation grates. That way, on the night of the escape, they could simply push the grate through and expand its perimeter so they could fit through the hole. Amazingly, throughout this whole period, they simply covered their work in progress with musical instruments and cardboard replicas of the wall. On the night of the escape, the four men escaped through their grates and to a hidden landing area straight above their cell block. This landing area was a proper escape workshop. For months, the men had been going to that area, perfecting their escape plan. They even had a makeshift periscope to take turns as lookout guards. In the workshop, they made the dummies and tools needed for their escape. But on that summer night, no matter how hard Alan pushed his cell grate, he couldn't get the wall to break down. The man who'd come up with the plan was the only one left behind. He died in Alcatraz 16 years later. Frank, John, and Clarence, on the other hand, made it to the workshop and climbed all the way to the prison ceiling via pipes. On the ceiling was an air vent that they had already pried off a few days ago. Around 10:30 p.m., someone reported a metal clinking sound. That was the air vent being pushed onto the roof. No one knew what it was at the time, but that was when Frank and the Anglin brothers made it out of Alcatraz. However, this wasn't the end. Remember, Alcatraz was surrounded by fast freezing waters? So as soon as they climbed down the prison walls via more pipes, the three men reached their 6 by 14-foot rubber raft, something else they constructed in their workshop. How did they make it, you ask? Using 50 raincoats, stitched together and vulcanized by holding the seams up to the heat from the steam pipes. They inflated the raft with a concertina, a musical instrument Frank had ordered a few months prior to the escape. With the raft, the men set out across San Francisco Bay, with a stop at Angel Island on the way to the U.S. mainland.
The plan was to sail across San Francisco Bay in their raft to Angel Island, about 2 miles north of Alcatraz Island. From there, they would sail again.
According to Alan West, the plan was to steal a car and clothing as soon as they reached San Francisco. But here's the final crazy part. To this day, no one knows anything about Frank or the Anglin brothers. It's unknown if they all made it to shore in the first place. There is a theory that their raft sunk before they could reach the mainland, as a bag of treasured possessions belonging to Clarence was found in the water. If the raft did sink, the men couldn't have swam to shore. The water temperature and wild currents would have most likely taken their lives. But as nothing was proven, we can choose the end we want to this story. This last story tops the list, not just because of Ronnie's outlandish escape, because he managed to live a long and happy life afterward. Ronald Arthur Biggs was born on August 8, 1929 in London. In the early 1960s, he had a wife and 3 sons and a history of petty crime and small-time robberies. Pressed for cash to buy a bigger house for his family, Ronnie joined a gang and plotted one of the biggest train heists in history. It's known as the Great Train Robbery. Initially, Ronnie's task was only to find a driver for the Royal Mail night train so that the team could stop it on its way to Glasgow and direct it to their chosen destination. Through his carpentry job, Ronnie did rope a train conductor into the scheme, but once at the train, he realized he couldn't operate this type of train.
Therefore, the driver of the intercepted train, Jack Mills, was caught with an iron bar and forced to move the engine and mail carriages forward to a nearby bridge over a roadway which had been chosen as the unloading point.
The problem was, when Jack was hit with an iron bar, he fell and hit his head even harder. 7 tough years later, he would die.
There was violence, that's quite true, but only in a very, very small degree. Mr. Mills was only hit once on the head, and when he fell, apparently he hit his head on something that was sticking out in the cabin of the train, and he received a second injury.
The holdup was planned down to the most minute details, and the robbery earned the gang a staggering £2.6 million. In 1963, this was an absolutely huge sum of money. Ronnie's cut was £147,000, equivalent to £3,247,800, or $4,128,565 today. But by 1964, the whole gang had been arrested. Ronnie was sentenced to 30 years at the Wandsworth prison in London. However, Ronnie only spent 15 months in prison. On July 8, 1965, Ronnie scaled a wall with a rope ladder and jumped onto a van waiting on the other side of the wall.
I was one of these special watch prisoners. I had to arrange for my 2 minders within the prison. They were going to run and grab the guards who were going to grab me when I made the escape.
Yep, Ronnie's gang was still as organized as ever.
When the van pulled up here, there was Paul Seaborn inside. Ronnie Leslie was the driver, and there was one other person helping who's been referred to as Blackie, so I think he must remain Blackie even now.
Ronnie immediately fled to Paris, where he spent £40,000 on plastic surgery to change his appearance and evade justice. Then, he flew to Australia on a false passport under the name Terry Cook. In 1966, his wife and his kids joined him, also on false passports, but the marriage would soon come to an end. Then, Ronnie changed his name again to Michael Haynes and ran to Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. There, he became a sort of a playboy figure, living a lavish lifestyle and even making a punk record, No One Is Innocent, with the Sex Pistols. Repeatedly, Ronnie was protected by Brazilian law from extradition and imprisonment. In 1974, Daily Express tracked him down to Rio and filmed him discussing his criminal life and current life.
Of all your criminal acts, how many jobs did you get away with?
Oh, I would say a pretty big percentage.
Scotland Yard arrived soon afterward, but Biggs could not be extradited because his girlfriend nightclub dancer, Raimundo de Castro, was pregnant. Brazilian law at the time did not allow a parent of a Brazilian child to be extradited. In March 1981, he was kidnapped by a gang of adventurers and smuggled to Barbados by boat. Their aim was to bring him back to Britain, but the Barbados High Court decided the rules governing extradition to Britain had not been properly put before the island's parliament, and Ronnie was allowed to return to Rio. By 2000, though, Ronnie was ill and poor, and in one last stint that earned him fandom, he surrendered to the British police, but he did so in style. Striking a deal with the Sun newspaper, they flew him back to the UK in an executive jet, where he was served curry, Marmite, and beer. In prison again, Ronnie's health declined rapidly through multiple strokes until he couldn't eat, walk, or talk. In 2009, he was released on compassionate grounds. He died a free man 4 years later. Much like John Dillinger and El Chapo, Ronnie Biggs became a controversial Robin Hood figure. Some hailed him as a cool outlaw who used flaws in the law to his advantage.
Sadly, we lost Ron during the night. As always, his timing was perfect to the end. Keep him and his family in your thoughts.
Others remember him as a dangerous, remorseless man who shouldn't be glorified online.
Come on, media. Biggs wasn't a cuddly heart of gold Cockney character to be feted. His gang beat a man with an iron bar, ruining his life.
Thanks for watching, y'all. What's your favorite prison escape? Do you know any other gangsters or drug lords' escapes? Let me know down in the comment section. And before you go, make sure you like, subscribe, and hit that bell button so you never miss another episode. See you next time.